Well, despite the current COVID crisis that exists, believe it or not, the financial planning industry is still booming and thriving. I looked at one comment this week about that indicated that the baby boomers, any baby boomers here? Those born from 1954 to 1964? Anybody in the room like that? Yep, they're all over the place here. I'm so encourage you to admit your age. It's great in public like that. They're on the verge of transferring around $30 trillion of wealth to the next generation, which would be the largest transfer of wealth in American history, despite the fact of what we're committing ourselves to in the trillions of dollars of debt that we're also inheriting. Nonetheless, that's a lot of money that's about to change hands. Some are estimating that the certified financial planning industry is expected to grow by 7% from 2018 to 2028. That's significant because any other occupation is only growing no more than 5% in that same period of time. With all that transfer of wealth moving as an inheritance from one generation to another, you can see how that industry is growing. And it just reminds ourselves how much we tend to think about, how much we live for, planning, putting together what we often refer to as an inheritance. How much time, how much money, how much thought goes into living for and planning for and transferring on wealth to another generation. It would likely be a good exercise for us to think about how much time, how much money, how much stress is involved in our gathering wealth, trying to keep it secure, and even thinking we're going to leave that wealth. Yes, there's good and necessary stewardship that we need to give time and attention to with what God has given us. I know that before our extensive travel in 2019, especially the international travel that we took, Kelly and I spent a little bit of time and some money just planning on what would happen if we didn't come back. What would happen if, with our children and with what we possess, how would we use it? To whom would we give it? And trying to think through that and say, is there any sense in which our Christian faith is speaking to that? So there's good stewardship to be had, but a lot of people are really stressed over this issue. In fact, it consumes many people's entire life. Much of life is spent working to gain more, stressing on how to keep it, strategizing on who's going to get it when we're gone. For those who tend to worry about gaining and securing a significant estate, we are oftentimes immediately reminded of Jesus' exhortation in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 25, when he said, "Do not be worried about your life." And what did he mean by your life? Don't be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? But seek first what? The kingdom. His kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And all God's people said, that's true. We know that. So there's a lot of people out there who are worried about gaining and keeping. Now, the reality is, in our world, in our culture, we have a lot of people who have a lot, which is everyone in this room. We have a lot. And we can stress ourselves on keeping it. And we can even pride ourselves in it. And we're reminded of the words of the Lord Jesus to those who have a lot and they want to keep it and even boast in it. We're reminded of the rich fool in the book of Luke, chapter 12, whose land was very productive and he had more than he knew what to do with. So he thought it would be wise to build bigger barns. Or, in more sanctified language, to be a wise steward and just put it in the bank and let it grow more and more and more in his pride. He said, "Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Only to hear God say, "You fool. This very night your soul is required of you. And now, who will own what you have prepared?" So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Do you think about living life that way? It's reality. We have a lot. We need to be wise with it. It's reality that we are concerned about how to use what we have, how to gain what would be necessary to provide for our families. But do you live with all of that with a sense of what is longer lasting? We're readily reminded that living by faith, which is the subject of chapter 11 in the book of Hebrews, living by faith touches everything in life. Living by faith is an approach to life that centralizes faith in regard to everything, including our inheritance. Faith must govern the way we think about and what we expect regarding our future inheritance, either what we're going to do with what we have and who's going to get it, how do we keep it now, how do we grow it. Faith must govern all of that. And for the Christian, our expectations about our living for an inheritance is a life lived not primarily for what we can gain, not primarily for how we can secure it, not primarily for to whom we're going to give it, because our estate, our inheritance, is not connected to this present passing life. It's related more to the one that is to come. You remember Jesus' words then at the end of that parable about the rich fool. He said in Luke 12:33, "Sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts which do not wear out." And what did he mean by that? What's a money belt that doesn't wear out? An unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near, nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where's your heart? So what we've been learning in the book of Hebrews, we've been looking at, especially last week when we began looking at these examples, practical examples of how living by faith fleshes itself out in the day-to-day. So Abel taught us the lesson of how to worship by faith. Enoch taught us and demonstrated how to fellowship with God by faith. Noah was a great lesson on how to obey the word of God by faith. What's Abraham? Because he's next. Abraham, at least in this section that we're going to look at today, Abraham teaches us how to live with our inheritance, how to think about inheritance. It talks about an inheritance by faith. It really does reorient how we think about what is to come and how we're living now in light of that. Abraham gains a lot of attention here in this chapter. In fact, there's more comments spoken here about Abraham than any other person, and for good reason. Abraham and the promise that God made to him is a promise that God is fulfilling through the rest of biblical history, even to this very moment and into the future. Abraham is a pivotal person within the book of the Bible. In so many places in Scripture, so many places, it would be innumerable for us to mention them and even give enough description of them. So many places in the Scripture, there is the promise that God gave to Abraham that is replayed over and over and over and is the motivation and the genesis for most of what God does in the Scripture. Why does He preserve Israel? For the promise that He made to Abraham. Why does Christ come? Because of a promise that He made to Abraham. Why is Christ coming again? Because of a promise that He made to Abraham. All of it is connected to that pivot point of the Bible in Genesis chapter 12. And the writer of Hebrews goes back to that. Even our salvation is given in terms of what we learn about Abraham. Anybody who is a person of faith has a faith like Abraham's, Romans chapter 4 says. The promises made to Abraham still govern his promise to the nation of Israel and shows how specific God's faithfulness actually will be, which is displayed in Romans 9, 10, and 11. The promise made to Abraham defines his ultimate descendant, Jesus Christ, who is the one who brings fruition to everything that God did promise to Abraham. Abraham has a pivotal role. And so he's a critical illustration of what living by faith looks like. That's why it's been so helpful if you go back to our recent studies in the book of Genesis that we've been doing in the summer months, and Lord willing, this summer and into the early fall, we're going to finish up that study in the book of Genesis. We've been learning so much about the faith of Abraham and God. It's been very helpful. And so the writer of Hebrews plunges us back into that Old Testament description of Abraham and his faith and uses Abraham as an illustration to us. And here in verses 8 to 12, here is a statement about living a faith-filled life in light of our future inheritance. How do you approach the here and the now in regard to an inheritance you will gain in the future? Now, typically speaking, when you talk about an inheritance, you're talking about three components to that inheritance: property and how you're going to gain it, permanence, how you're going to guard it, and people, to whom will you give it. Those are three different components that you will find present in any conversation about an inheritance: property, permanence, people. Those are the three components that you're going to see emphasized here in this passage when we talk about Abraham and his approach and his mindset by faith toward future inheritance. Do you live in light of an earth-bound inheritance or a heavenly one? A temporary inheritance or an eternal one? The inheritance you focus on the most now will govern the way you live now and will determine whether you live by faith or not. So let's look at these three different components. Three different components to consider in regard to how living by faith now governs our approach to the future and our future inheritance. So that's what we want to talk about. And it's going to all surround those three different components I just mentioned: property, permanence, people. How should we approach a future inheritance in a way that impacts us right now? Well, first of all, in verse 8, we're going to learn this: live in light of future property. Live in light of future property. Did you know when Abraham was given a promise about land, Abraham was not focused on land for his present life. He was focused on that land for his eternal life. He was focused on a property that God had promised, and his mind was not set on just gaining it in the present, but in the future. If his mindset was just gaining that property in the present, he lived a life of failure. You know why? He never gained it. He never owned it, nor did his son, nor did his grandson. Never did. So when he lived for a property and a piece of land, how did he think about it? It's really fascinating what the writer of Hebrews explains to us here in verse 8. Look at verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Verse 8 is all about the place of Abraham's future inheritance that motivated how he conducted his life here on earth. It was all about the location for his future, and I would suggest to you his everlasting home. And that governed his present living. Verse 8 is all about going to a place that he would inherit. And it governed all of his expectations of how God would play that out. by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. Now, to understand a little bit about the background in this, I want us to go back into the Old Testament, look at when Abraham was called and the surrounding events that were taking place around the call of Abraham. So go back to the book of Genesis just for a moment. I know I've spent hours and hours on this, and we're not going to do that here, Lord willing. But I do want to review a little bit of it, just to remind ourselves what was going on. If you remember, last week we ended with the account of Noah. Noah is Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, 9. And Noah lived in that time when the flood came. Well, what happened after the flood? Well, Noah emerges into what we could say is kind of a recreated earth, isn't it? But still, humanity was plagued with the seed of sin within his nature. And so what did that produce? As generations began to develop from Noah and his family, it produced generations of sinful people, didn't it? Which leads us into chapter 10, which is the sections just after Noah's life. The account of humanity in Genesis 10 describes a people who come from Noah's sons. It's actually bookended there. You see in verse 1 of chapter 10, these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Sons were born to them after the flood. The very end of that chapter, verse 32, these are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies by their nations, and out of these the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So generations of people developed, nations emerged, nations have borders, nations are groups of people aligning themselves in identity with one another, and nations develop. And that created a very interesting scene, because you come to chapter 11, verse 1, and what's happening among this people. Now, the whole earth used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there, and they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar, and they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city." You say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. To build a city? Isn't that what nations would do? Sure. But notice what they say about the city. Come, let us build, now notice the phrase, for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into, where? Heaven. Why do you want to go that high? And let us make for ourselves, what? A name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. This is really fascinating, because this is simply replaying, in a corporate sense, what took place in Genesis chapter 3 in Eve's heart. Remember Eve? What would the fruit do for her if she were to eat it? It would make a name for herself. It would. She would be like God. In fact, she would be independent from God, because she could then determine for herself right and wrong. She could be her own person. What are these people wanting now? Let's build a city for ourselves that reaches to heaven, where God is, and let's establish our name, independent of Him. It's simply the curse replaying itself again. God comes down, it says, to see the city, like He didn't know. No, He comes down to personally visit the city and to see not only what they're building, but the motivations that drive their building it. And what did He do for these people? He confused their languages so that it would no longer be any unity of which they could rally around for themselves, to build for themselves a name for themselves in being a rival to God. And what happened to the people then? They dispersed. They dispersed all over the globe. They dispersed all over the globe in such a mindset and with a heart that did not necessarily love the things of God. In fact, what's happening again is the world is being populated not with people who desire to bear the image of God in righteousness, but a people who desire to rival the image of God with themselves, which is at the heart of every sinful person, isn't it? That is the world in which God determined at that point, I will call out a man from a particular family, and in this man I will call him, and I will bring mercy and blessing to all these people who are turning against me. That's where the call of God began. You see it in chapter 11, beginning in verse 27. These are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. Significant. Ur of the Chaldeans, likely some place in southwestern Iraq today. That is where Haran dies, and so Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves there. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. And Sarah was barren, and she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son. Now watch this carefully. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, would be Abram's nephew, his grandson, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram, in order to enter where? They went from Ur, and they were going to go to where? Canaan. And who was leading them? Not Abram, but Terah, Abram's father. Abram's father, Terah, his intention was not to settle in a land called Haran, which they eventually settled in, but to actually go down into Canaan. Why? Why did they want to go down to Canaan? Well, we don't know from this text here, but later in the Bible, when Stephen in the book of Acts in chapter 7 is describing what has happened, he describes that God came to Abram before his father had died and told him to go down to Canaan. Evidently, we don't know all the background and the scene that was happening. When Haran, one of the sons of Terah, died in Terah's presence, likely Abraham was pushing his father to go down into Canaan, to get out of this land. Perhaps they believed it was cursed. We don't know exactly what it was, but Abram was no doubt influencing his father to go down to this land. But notice, verse 31, they went from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan, and they went as far as Haran, and they settled there. That's in southeastern Turkey. You can visit there even today. And that's where they settled. They stopped. So they didn't go all the way to Canaan. They stopped. Terah didn't want to go any further. This is where he wanted to land. They didn't cross the Arabian Peninsula, which would likely have been impossible for them to do, to make a straighter shot over to the land of Canaan. They went up and around, and they stopped right at the top. They didn't come down into Palestine. They just stopped. Now, Acts chapter 7 says God had already come to Abram and said that. Now, what you have to understand at this point, too, is Abram and his father and all of their generations were not followers of Yahweh at that time. They were actually pagans. They likely believed in many different gods. Joshua chapter 24, verse 2 gives us that idea when it says that Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, they served other gods. They weren't followers of Yahweh. That's likely one of the reasons why he didn't have any desire to go back down to Canaan. Why follow that God? And yet God comes to Abram when they're in Haran, and he says, the journey's not finished. Chapter 12, verse 1, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country, from Haran, where they had settled, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. He knew what that land was. They'd already been making their way there. God had already told him to go down to that land. Now it's time for you to pick up and leave everything, and everyone who doesn't want to go down there, you go down. Can you imagine what this means? Your father doesn't want to go. Leave him. Your family wants to settle here. This is their hometown now. Leave that. You're going to go down to another land. What land? Canaan. Where's that? Abraham had never been there. Never seen it. Did not know anything about it. Just knew God had called him. This is likely the sign of Abram's conversion, where he was willing to follow God and leave everything else behind. Everything else. What would that leave in store for him? If he leaves his father, what inheritance does he have? If he leaves all of his family, to whom is he going to give anything to? Abram's not a superpower at this time. Abram has himself and his wife and his nephew, and what little they possess together, to go down to a land they had never seen. Leave your country, that is your property. Leave your relatives, that is your security. Leave your father's house, that's your people. Leave everything connected to inheritance, people, permanence, property, and go to a new place, of which I'll show you. And what will I give you? And I will make you a great nation. I'll take you to a land that I'll show you, a new piece of property. I'll make you a great nation, not just a nation, but a great nation. There's a sense of security. And I'll bless you and make your name great, and so you will be a blessing. And I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And here's this most amazing statement on which hangs the very gospel message. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. What's interesting is the phrase, all the families, is the same word used in Genesis chapter 10 to talk about all the peoples of the earth who were scattered across the earth. All the families who had walked away from God, all the families of the earth that would turn their back on God, I will use you to bring divine blessing to all of them. God called Abram to leave a home, security, family connected to his earthly father and their identity with their pagan gods, and go to a new home, new security, a new family that would be connected to God as his ultimate God and provider, to a land he had never seen, a land I will show you, and I'll make you great. That would be hard to believe. As we already learned in Genesis 11, verse 30, how many children had Sarah had? None. How many was she expecting to have? None. She was barren. She couldn't have children. How are you going to be a great nation? I mean, everything about this promise would be hard to believe, wouldn't it? So leave everything I know, go to a land I haven't seen. I'm going to be a great nation, and from my generations, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. I've got a wife who can't have children. I'm leaving everything behind. I have no idea of what if the people in that land aren't so welcoming of me, and they don't want me to inherit all of their land, which is easy to believe, isn't it? It didn't seem to bother him. He went. Verse 4 says in Genesis 12, so Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. There's his conversion. He left everything and everyone to follow Yahweh. And Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. I'm going to make you the person who brings blessing to all the earth. And any who oppose you, I'll oppose them, God says. You're going to be my representative of my name and my blessing to everyone on the planet. Do you really think that Abraham believed that all of that would happen in his lifetime? I don't. It would take generations for that to happen. It would take a long time. It would definitely go well beyond him. He knew that this promise was not a promise that he was likely going to see in his own lifetime. How motivating would that be to you? So I'm going to go down here. I'm going to establish something that's going to outlive me, that I'll actually probably never see the fullness of. And yet he still did it. He believed God that much that he still did that. Just think about that. He had no land. He owned nothing. It would take generations to build this kind of blessing for the whole earth. It would not happen in his lifetime. He had no army. He wasn't a nation. He left behind his family. He had no identity. There was no security. It's inconceivable that all of that could be procured in his own lifetime. He had no children. Lifespans were so short then, there was no way that he would ever believe that he would have people that could comprise nations that will the earth. So whatever this promise is, he knew it wasn't something connected to his life and his lifetime. God was calling Abraham to live a life that would be lived in light of a blessing to come. So if we go back to Hebrews with that in mind, it says in verse 8, he went out and he obeyed that call by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. Now catch that. He lived his life for the inheritance, the future inheritance. He went to a place, and that place was to be his future inheritance. And God was specific, and he would clarify that inheritance in Genesis 15. Genesis 15, if you'll remember, is God reiterating to him again the promise. And that promise, if you read Genesis 15 carefully, the whole promise is connected to that land, that specific land in which he had gone. And you remember there was a ceremony. While Abraham was asleep, he saw a vision of God walking in between animals that had been cut in two, which was a ceremony of God saying, I am going to stake my very existence on fulfilling this promise that I have just made to you about this land. It will be completed. Abraham knew that promise would not be completed in his lifetime, but God says, I stake my existence that I will finish it. So he believed it. He believed it. And that land would become the epicenter from which all the world would be renewed. That land would yield eventual world renewal. That property. Now listen, if you knew that was going to happen when you bought your home, in the home that you bought, in the property that you bought. I've got this piece of property out in the middle of nowhere in Missouri. It's a cornfield. There's no population here. And if you knew that in that place, the rest of the world for eternity would be blessed, how would you live your life? That's essentially what's going on here. He lived with the end in mind, didn't he? He anticipated the end. It drove him to live by faith. That property, that piece of land that was staked on God's name and God's promise and God's very existence. Now listen, that's no shot in the dark. What God is telling him this? The God who created heaven and earth. Right? The God who knows all things, the God who owns all things and is sovereign over everything. He's not gambling here. It's not a gamble to trust God. It's a sure bet. Faith is not living for what you currently comprehend about how God's direction is going to work out within your lifetime, friends. Are you one of those folks? Because I tend to be this way. I like to make a decision about the future when I have investigated every possibility, at least every possibility that I can imagine. And then I still delay by going to other people to find out if they know of some possibilities I haven't thought about. And I will drag the decision on and on and on until I can be just absolutely sure. You know people like that? Do not elbow your husband, ladies. Sure, I understand that. We just want to be absolutely sure. But in the end, there's so many unknowns you can't predict. And life is filled with all of that. Should I take that job? Well, only if it can guarantee X, Y, Z. Should I leave this one and go do that? Well, only if I can maintain this kind of income, etc., and I can guarantee that outcome. Well, you can't guarantee any of that, can you? With any decision you make, you can be relatively sure. You can say, that seems to make sense, that would be wise, but you have no idea what the road holds. What kind of wine, what kind of curves and turns exist in the future. At some point you say, but I trust God. I live for him. My life is in his hands. I belong to me. He's promised me. What has God promised you as a Christian? Eternity with himself here. You can trust him. Faith is never tied to anything connected to what we think of as a home connected to this life. It's always connected to a home in the future. That should remind us to hold loosely to what we possess. What you will possess, friends, is of far greater value than anything you could possess now. We really need to be careful about spending our life's efforts trying to secure a wealth that will only last in this lifetime alone. Yes, be a wise steward, plan well. Listen to Dave Ramsey. To a point. To a point. Live in a way that enjoys what God gives you now. Do that. But never center your joys in those things that God has given you now. Live wisely. Plan well. Don't trust all of your plans. Don't be known as a stingy tightwad in this world. Don't be known for that. Don't be known for building massive amounts of temporary wealth and a materialistic person. Don't be known for that. We don't live for what we amass now. We don't live for what we can spend now. We don't live that way as believers because our inheritance isn't tied to our property now. Think about it. We'll own it all in eternity to come. We will. See, we have this wrong idea. We said it a while back that eternity is going to be us existing in some spiritual state somewhere out there, and that's not right. Eternity is us living forever here on this earth, an earth remade under the rule of Jesus Christ. We live here and inherit and rule it with him. We're going to get something far better than anything we could possess now. So don't be known for what you can amass or what you spend. Be known for how you live now because you are fixed on what you will ultimately possess. That's how Abraham lived by faith. That's the example left for us. Living by faith, when you think about inheritance, you live for a property you will inherit to come, not merely for what you can have now. That's the first component of how to live by faith in regard to our inheritance. Let's look at a second component that we find in verses 9 through 10. You don't just live in light of a future property, but live in light of future permanence. I mean, you can own something now, and then you'll sweat out the rest of your days trying to keep it. But if you live for what is guaranteed for you in the future, you don't have to sweat out keeping it because it's guaranteed for you. Live in light of a future permanence. Notice how that governed Abraham's life. Verse 9. By faith, he lived as what? An alien in the land of promise. As in a foreign land. Does that make any sense? God said this land is to be your land. And how did he live in that land? Not like an owner, but like an alien in the land God promised him, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. By faith, he lived as an alien. Lived as an alien is actually one word in the Greek New Testament. and is a word that means to live like a visitor. A visitor, someone who's coming and going, not like an owner. There's a difference, isn't there? If you're a visitor, you have a different outlook in terms of what you should expect, how you treat things. I mean, you can say to somebody, and you've probably done this, hey, come into my house and just treat it like it's yours. And then later on, you're telling a friend, he came in here and acted like he owned the place. Right? Because you tell them, come in here and just treat it like it's yours, and they do, and you're like, well, I don't mean like that. Have a little respect. It's not yours. I own it. Be careful with some of this. Don't think that when he lived in the land as a visitor, it didn't mean that he didn't accumulate much in terms of wealth. Abraham, as we learned in our study of his life in the book of Genesis, he became a virtual superpower in that age. I mean, he had vast amounts of wealth, an incredible amount of property and wealth that was associated with him. But he was essentially a nomad. If you read from Genesis 12 to Genesis 25, it is a series of him moving here and then there and here and then there. He's always moving about. He's never stationary, never a permanent housing development that he establishes for himself. And throughout all of that, he only bought one piece of property in the land that God told him was his forever. One piece of property, and it came about in Genesis 23 when his wife died. Do you remember that? And he bought a cave. And the people of the land, they respected him. They knew that he was a big superpower, and so it would be in their interest to just give it to him. And then later in generations, they say, well, we never gave it to you. And so he demanded, no, I'm going to pay the price. And they tried to barter for a small price so that maybe later on they could say, oh, you didn't pay enough for that. And he said, no, I'm going to pay the full price. I'm going to own this. And the only piece of property he ever owned in that land of promise throughout his entire life was that little cave. It was like he planted the flag on the moon. He just put it right here and said, this land is my land, and I own this little part. It's like, I own this part, but I'm going to own all of it. That's what he was saying, essentially. And he owned that little piece. And he always lived like a nomad, an alien. And what was the expression of that? Well, Hebrews tells you he never lived in a city. He lived in what? Tents, dwelling in tents. It was never a permanent structure. And you'll find that in the life of Abraham. There was never a permanent dwelling that he actually lived in. And not only Abraham, but it says with Isaac and Jacob, who were co-heirs of the same promise, which is fascinating too. Isaac never realized the totality of the promise that God made about that land. Jacob never realized the totality of God's promise regarding that land. They lived in tents. Jacob, for a time, you can find one time where he and his relatives took over a city, but they didn't stay there long. They never had their own cities. They didn't build a city for their name, for themselves, like you saw in Genesis chapter 11. They didn't represent themselves. They represented God, and God was unfolding his plan step by step. Isn't that fascinating? 3 generations to whom was made this promise about this land, and none of them ever saw it completed in their lifetime. And they believed. Why? What would motivate that? Where's your sense of permanency? Where's your sense of security if you never receive what you're hoping in your own lifetime? What's found in verse 10. How could they live in tents in a land given to them by promise? Because the promise wasn't going to be fulfilled in their lifetime, and they were looking for something beyond what they could build. Verse 10, he was looking for the city. What does that refer to? Well, it's the opposite of tents. They dwelled in tents, but he wasn't looking for a permanent tent. He was looking for a city. And he wasn't looking for something he could construct, but a city that has foundations, there's permanence, whose architect and builder is God. There's eternal permanence. What does this mean? That he was looking for something beyond that piece of property? No, I don't think so. God said, this property, this is where you're going to be, and from this will be the epicenter from which you will bring blessing to the entirety of all the nations of the earth, from this land, from this place. But he wasn't looking for it in his lifetime. He was looking for it at a time when God would establish it for him, when God would bring about his rule through Abraham and his generations that would impact the rest of time and eternity. This is why throughout the Old Testament the land is so consequential to the Jewish people. It's the place for their, according to what you read across the Old Testament, their eternal inheritance. It is a place that the Messiah will physically return and from where he will be located when he rules over the entire earth. He will fulfill that promise explicitly as he made it. Abraham anticipated that, when God would do that. By the way, we said this at the end of chapter 10 in the book of Hebrews, and I mentioned it and alluded to it a moment ago. The promise of God for us and for everybody who has faith, for all who will believe in Christ, is that one day after Christ's return, we will all inherit not the land of Palestine, but what will we inherit? The entire earth. You say, well, maybe then the land of Palestine is just kind of a symbol for the rest of the earth. Well, that's not the way the Bible actually talks about it. But the Bible does talk about nations that would find the eternal blessing of God. Nations, by definition, have borders, don't they? And if there are nations that exist under the rule of Christ, where will they live? All over the earth. That's the sense in which the Abrahamic promise in Genesis chapter 12 is going to be fulfilled. Abraham will have a nation that comes from him, and that place and that land will bring blessing, saving blessing to all the earth, and all the nations of the earth will come under that saving blessing of God as they dwell on the earth. Matthew 5:5, the gentle will inherit what? The earth. The earth. Why is this here? This is given to us as another example of what it means to live by faith in what we're hoping for, our future inheritance, and the permanence of it. Abraham never looked at that land of promise he lived in as, this is the permanent place for me. He lived in it like he was a visitor because he was waiting God to finish the work. We are called in the same vein at this time. We live here as if we were visitors, not owners. Not at this time, because God has yet to finish the work. When he returns, when Christ returns, we reign with him. Then we're owners. 1 Peter 2:11, beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers. How are we to view ourselves? Aliens, strangers. So don't give yourself to fleshly lusts that wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. So live such a life as an alien and a stranger that identifies your life so connected to the purposes of God that when God returns, they see the value of your life. Isn't that an interesting way to live? Live now as if the only value of your life is connected to God in his ultimate return. Or do people look at us now and say, you're all about the here and now. You're all about living life as if this is all that life was about. See, that was not Abraham. That's not where he found security. That's not where he found permanence. He lived like an alien, a stranger in a foreign land. This is why we hold loosely to what we own. We don't really own it right now. We're stewards of it, but we're strangers in this land. We guard our desires so that what we lust after materially is not what we find our joy in, because it's so temporary, and we're longing for something more, something greater, something deeper, something more permanent. You remember the rich man and Lazarus? And Jesus says to the rich man when he dies, you had your good when you were living. That's all you get. The rest of eternity for you is misery and sorrow because you live for now, not eternity. You live for the temporary, not the permanent. Permanence is never gained through our present property. Our inheritance is the earth in Christ's return. We live with that mindset now, just like Abraham. So there's property that's a part of the way we live now that we're thinking about in our future inheritance. There's a permanence we live with in our minds now that we think of in terms of our future inheritance. And then last and thirdly, we live in light of a future people. A future people. That's verses 11 and 12. Verse 11, by faith, even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So verses 11 to 12 talk about future generations, a future people, don't they? There is some debate that exists as to whether this verse in verse 11 is really about Abraham being enabled to produce a son. The New International Version emphasizes Abraham, but here in the New American Standard, the English Standard Version, there's a reference to Sarah. Usually because there's that phrase, received the ability to conceive, is literally in the Greek text to have the ability to lay down a seed. That's the actual words, to lay down a seed. And they would say that's only what a male can do, so this must be about Abraham. But the Bible doesn't use that phrase that way, and a woman can bring forth a seed. And that's been shown throughout the Scriptures, and Sarah is the one emphasized here. And that might surprise you. When you think Sarah, do you think faith? So somebody laughed, because they don't. Sarah laughed, didn't she? You remember that. Not just when she laughed, but even before then. Abraham was promised he was going to be a great nation, and how many kids do they have? None. So she comes up with a plan, Genesis 16. The plan is, you get your slave, and you marry her, and you have a child, and that child will be mine. Well, that did not satisfy, did it? So, listen, it wasn't Abraham's inability to have children or to produce children that was the problem. Sarah was barren. And that didn't sit well with her when he actually did have a son. And then later, you'll remember when it seemed the Lord and a couple of angels come down to see Abraham. And they're standing outside the tent. Sarah's inside doing what she was doing. And the angels are telling Abraham, by this time next year, you're going to have a son. And she said, yeah, right. And laughed, just like that. Laughed. The angel said to Abraham in Genesis 18, verse 9, where's Sarah, your wife? And he said, there in the tent. And he said, I'll surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and Sarah was past childbearing, and Sarah laughed to herself. She didn't even actually do it maybe out loud, but to herself, saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? I'm old and he's old. There's no way this is happening. And the Lord said to Abram, why did Sarah laugh? That's scary, friends. She said it to herself, and the Lord brings it up in public. And Sarah no doubt heard that and yells through the tent door, I didn't laugh. And the Lord says, yes, you did. You did. And responds, is there anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I'll return to you, and at this time next year, Sarah will have a son. Guess what happened? She had a son. Isaac, son of the promise. say, but that doesn't seem like Sarah was a woman of faith. Well, was Abraham a man of faith? Well, we always think of Abraham as a man of faith. Abraham had his bad moments too, didn't he? I mean, he receives the promise, Genesis chapter 12, then it gets hard in the land, a famine comes, and where does he go? Egypt, outside the land. And he puts his wife at risk. Puts his wife at risk who is supposed to bear the children who would bless the world? What kind of faith is that? Friends, we're not talking about people who have perfect faith here. We're not talking about people who are perfect in their faith all the time. But when you look at the trajectory of Abraham's life, it's moving upward all the time towards a man of faith who trusts God. And that's characteristic of Sarah too. When she's mentioned in other places in the Bible, like 1 Peter chapter 3, she is a model of someone to follow because of her faithfulness, because of her character, not just because of one or two moments in life where she couldn't see the outcome and she had moments of doubt. But the vast swath of her life was one of trusting in God. I mean, after all, she's following Abraham. And how many times did she obey what he said, even when he was leading her wrong? She was a woman of faith. She went with him. She traveled with him. But I want you to see something. They weren't thinking that Isaac was the end-all, be-all of the promise, because how do you bless all the nations of the earth? And beyond that, Genesis chapter 17 said, I'm going to make many nations from you. How's that going to happen from this one kid? She wasn't thinking that was going to all happen in her lifetime or even Isaac's lifetime, especially when you look at the promise that's rehearsed again in verse 12. There was born, even of one man, a child, and him, that's Abraham, as good as dead, as many descendants as the stars of the heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. When is that fulfilled? Eternity. This is a description of all the nations of the earth being blessed through that promise that would come through her child. This looked well beyond herself, well beyond others. She was living by faith in a future promise, and it governed everything about her life in the present. Who did she live for? Not Isaac, not Abraham, future generations. I mean, just think about that in some practical ways, like parenting. You ever think about parenting? The goal of parenting is not to keep your kids in your house forever. Yeah, you better respond. Yeah, that's right. It's not. It's not. Parenting is not about you making sure your kids are always connected to you forever. Parenting is about you stewarding the responsibility to raise image bearers of God to live for the glory of God, right? That's parenting. Now, you're not hoping they have a bad relationship with you. But guess what relationship ends in eternity? Parent-child relationships. Same thing with marriage. Marriage ends in eternity. There is no marrying or being given in marriage in eternity. Marriage is tied to this life and this world only. And so your marriage has never been designed to be the end-all, be-all of every relationship, is it? No, it is a model of something that goes beyond marriage. Parenting is a model and an activity that goes beyond parenting and beyond the family. And it has in its mind, at least from the Christian perspective, something eternal. In fact, when Jesus said to the Sadducees who believed there was no resurrection, Matthew chapter 22, he said, no, in eternity, there's no giving in marriage, there's no being given in marriage, there's none of that. You'll be like the angels. What did he mean by that? He says, in eternity, essentially every relationship you have will be better than the best and most intimate relationship you could have ever had on earth, and you'll have that with everybody in eternity. Can you imagine that? That's the promise? Yes. So then what do you live for now? Who do you live for now? What kind of relationships are you building now? What kind of relationships are you enjoying now? Putting all your eggs into the basket of being able to have a certain kind of image in front of a certain kind of people and that relationship terminates in this life or in the next. See what it means to live by faith when you think about your inheritance and what's to come? You live now in light of a future property to come. You live now in light of a future permanence that you will enjoy. You live now in light of a future people who will come. That shouldn't be new to us who follow Jesus. Do you remember what Jesus said to some people who said, "Oh, I want to follow you"? And he challenged them. Matthew 8. Just think about it. Don't turn there. Just listen to this. A scribe came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." What did he mean by that? You'll follow me wherever I go? I don't know where I'm sleeping tonight. Still want to come? I mean, the implication is the scribe doesn't want to go there. Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, permit me first to go bury my father." What does he mean by that? Daniel Pentamon taught us on some of this a few weeks ago. It's not likely that the father was dead. He was like, first let me live with my dad until he's gone, then I have the inheritance, I'll be self-sufficient, and then I'll come follow you. Sounds like a great plan, doesn't it? I won't have to live off anybody. Jesus, so sympathetic and compassionate, said, "Allow the dead to bury their own dead. You follow me." Drop it. Drop your plans. Drop all these pursuits for some kind of supposed permanence and property that you can gain for yourself and come follow me. Think about what he said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34. "Don't think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Because he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his own cross," which means if you love your life more than you love Christ, to preserve your life more than to give it up for the sake of Christ, he is not worthy of me. What did Jesus ask us to do? Give up everything in this life to follow him. Or how about Matthew 12:46? He's speaking to the crowds, and behold, his mother and brothers were standing outside seeking to speak to him, and someone said to him, "Behold, your mother and brothers, they're outside. You probably better cut this short. Mom's outside." You know Mom. Jesus said, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand toward the disciples, he said, "Behold, my mother and my brothers." Now, how can he say that? He's not trying to be disrespectful. He's trying to say, who do you live for? He's not trying to say everybody has to give up everything that they own in order to follow him, but you have to give up everything you own to follow him. It's not yours. Everything you own belongs to him, to be used by him, for his purposes, right? Everything. Because our inheritance is about the promise to be fulfilled. You say, well, what if that doesn't come in my lifetime? Join the club. Join the Abraham Club, the Sarah Club, the Isaac Club, the Jacob Club, the Disciples Club, the Church History Club. Do you really believe it'll all be worth it in the end? Then you live by faith. Let's pray together. Father, we know that thinking through these kinds of things are challenging to our heart's desires and affections. It's challenging to us. We wonder what we would be willing to give up for the sake of eternal fruit. Lord, I pray by the work of your Holy Spirit you begin to make this clear in the conscience of your people. Even challenge those who don't follow you right now in this moment. Challenge them on whether they see the value of eternity above the value of what they can perceive with their own eyes here and now. Challenge them if following Christ would mean more to them than following their own pursuits, which merely bring about temporary passing pleasures rather than eternal joys. Help us to think about the future and the inheritance we have there, and may it govern the way we approach our property and our relationships and our sense of security now. We pray that you would use this for your glory among us. And as you work out these details in our lives, help us to encourage one another, to exhort where it's necessary, to have compassion and concern for where we can help one another, so that we keep our eyes fixed on the value of Jesus and listening to him above every other voice. We pray in his name. Amen. Let's stand together.